Welcome back to Enola Holmes. Book 3. The Case of the Bizarre Bouquets. Lunatics have no common sense, thinks the matron. But then that's what deranges the faculties, isn't it? Lack of common sense. Take this new inmate now. If he had any sense, he would be exercising with the others in the airing yard on this beautiful sunny day. The first fine day of spring. He'd be following directions. Stand up straight, breathe deeply, lift your eyes and contemplate the glories of the firmament. Now march, left foot first. 1, 2, 3, 4. And he'd be doing himself some good. But instead, "Let me out," he demands for perhaps the 100th time. "I am an Englishman. Such treatment of a British citizen simply cannot be tolerated." While his tone is angry, he doesn't curse. She'll give him that. Even at his worst, when he fought with the keepers, when he blackened the director's eye, even when he hadn't cursed. Nor does he now, in the complaining vehemently. "Let me out! I demand my rights as a loyal subject of the Queen. Let me out of this confounded coffin, I say." It is not a coffin, Mr. Kippersalt. Sitting in a comfortless wooden chair, cushioned only by her own amplitude, while in her lap she knits a sock, the matron speaks in a bold yet soothing tone. The top and bottom resemble those of a coffin, perhaps, but you know quite well that a coffin would not have spindle work all up and down the sides so you can breathe, and I can see that you are not in any difficulties. Not in any difficulties? Unexpectedly, the man lying in the confines of the straint box started to laugh. At the sound of his laughter, the matron drops a stitch, frowns, and lays her knitting aside, reaching for paper and pencil instead. "Not in any difficulties in this fiendish device?" the man cries amidst unnaturally high-pitched yowls of laughter. "You do not appear to be physically indisposed," answers the matron with gentle dignity. "And you are lying on a clean pallet, and you can change your position. Move your hands. Certainly the crib is preferable to a straitjacket." "A crib? Is that what it's called?" The man is still laughing for no reason. The matron watches him narrowly, knowing she must take care of him. He was quite unexpectedly quick for such a stocky fellow, and resourceful too. He very nearly made it to the fence. In Mr. Kippersalt's barely started casebook she writes the date and time. Then, patient laughing and apparent hysteria. Earlier notations state that Mr. Kippersalt most strenuously resisted in putting on his grey woolen uniform while his own things were taken away for safekeeping. That he has refused food, that his urine is light and clear, he moves his bowels appropriately, and he seems to be quite of a cleanly nature. That he shows no deformity of the head, trunk, or limbs, that he exhibits intelligence of a sort, and that he uses a handkerchief. "A crib, as in cheating me of my freedom?" The man's unnerving laughter is quietening. Not a bad-looking man of middle age, a soldiery type. He strokes his mustache with his fingers as if to calm himself or to think. "When are you going to let me out?" "After the doctor has looked you over." After first administering chloral hydrate, the matron feels. He himself an addict to laudanum and the like, this asylum's doctors troubles himself little with the inmates other than to medicate them. "Doctor? I am a doctor!" The newly committed lunatic starts once again to howl with laughter. The matron writes, persists in his grandiose delusions. Setting the casebook aside, she takes up her knitting again. Trying to turn the heel of a sock can be most vexing, but that's the way things are when one is married to the director of a lunatic asylum. Always 7 things to do at once, never a quiet moment, to simply rest one's soul, go for a walk or look at a newspaper. The nurses require as much supervision as the patients do. Florence Nightingale's influence does not extend here, and the help is illiterate at best, if not in the grip of some vice, usually drink. The matron sighs, trying to pick up the stitch she dropped. She cannot keep a slight edge from creeping into voice as she replies. A doctor? That's not true, Mr. Kippersalt. Your documents of admission clearly state that you are a shopkeeper. My name is not Kippersalt. I am not the person you say I am. Why can I not make anyone in this hellish place understand that I'm here because of some absurd misapprehension? Feeling the man watching her from the coffin-like box in which he lies, the matron smiles, albeit wearily. In my experience the past 30 years, Mr. Kippersalt, patients often believe a mistake has been made, but it has never been so. How could it be, when such considerable sums of money changed hands? Take a gentleman like you, now. A number must have come here, declaring themselves to be Napoleon, that's the most frequent, but we have had a Prince Albert, a Sir Walter Drake, and a William Shakespeare. I'm telling you the truth. And some of these poor distracted minds are eventually cured. The matron speaks on, ignoring the interruption. But some of them remain here yet. Is that what you want, Mr. Kippersalt? To remain here for the rest of your life? My name is not Kippersalt. It's Watson. Even through the spindles, she can see his mustache bristling. With kindly whimsy, she retorts, We have a Sherlock Holmes in one of the other wards. I wonder whether he would care to vouch for you. You are mad, I tell you. I am John Watson, medical doctor and author. All you have to do is telephone Scotland Yard. Telephone? As if anyone this far north of London City had ever seen or used such a come-lately contraption. Just call Scotland Yard. Gandry's delusions again. And ask for Inspector Lestrade. He'll confirm my identity. Nonsense, the matron murmurs. Nonsense. He really thinks the director will make inquiries, give back a considerable fee and turn him loose? The man is raving. Shush now. Shh. As if trying to calm a child, she murmurs to him, concerned such passion might lead to brain fever if it did not abate. It had been 2 days now, and Mr. Kippersalt is still ranting just as irrationally as he was when they brought him in. A sad case, really. The matron is dealt with many lunatics, but she feels particularly sorry for this one, because he seems as if he might have so much good in him, if he were in his right mind. Chapter 1. It is difficult to choose a new name for oneself. Even more difficult, I imagine, than choosing a name for a child, for one is confusingly intimate with oneself, whereas one is barely acquainted with a baby upon its arrival. Some artistic whim had surely caused Mum to name me Enola, which backwards spells alone. Do not think about Mum. Although the large bruise on my face had faded, the even larger one upon my feelings had not. Thus I remained in my lodging on the first fine sunny day in March, 1889. With paper and pencil in hand, I sat at my open window. How welcome is fresh air, even the London variety, after a long winter. Looking out over the seething East End street. The scene below had attracted my attention, due to a quantity of mutton still on the hoof passing through, all manner of vehicle, including coal wagons, donkey carts, and costermongers' barrows, had locked shafts. I could hear the drivers shouting the most frightful oaths at one another. Red-coated army recruiters and other idlers looked on, grinning, while a blind beggar led a ragged child, trying to get past the jam. Street urchins climbed lampposts to stare and jeer, and women in sooty shawls hurried on their errands. They, the sorely overworked women of the slums, unlike me, had somewhere to go. Looking down at my paper in my lap, I found that I had written, Enola Holmes. Hastily and heavily I crossed this out, my very own name, the one I absolutely could not use. My brothers, Mycroft and Sherlock, you see, must not find me, for they quite wanted to take charge of me and transform me, via singing lessons and similar vapours, into an ornament for genteel society. Which legally they could do, forcing me into a boarding school, or into a convent, and an orphanage, a young ladies' academy of porcelain painting, wherever they chose. Legally, Mycroft the Elder could have me locked up in life in an insane asylum. Such confinement required only the signature of 2 medical doctors, one of whom would be the mad doctor who quite wanted money to run the place. Those in the signature of Mycroft himself. Any scheme to deprive me of my freedom I would not put beyond him. I wrote Ivy Meshel, the name I had used during the 6 months I had been a fugitive on my own. Ivy for fidelity, Meshel, a play on Holmes. Holmes, Meshol, Meshel, and I liked that name. I really wished I could keep it, but I was afraid I had discovered that Sherlock knew I used Ivy as a code name when communicating with Mum through the newspaper personal columns. What else did my oh-so-clever brother Sherlock, the one who, as opposed to the large and sessile Mycroft, was actually on the hunt for me? What did Sherlock know about me? What had he learned in the course of our most irregular dealings? I wrote, he knows I look like him. He knows I climb trees. He knows I ride a bicycle. He knows I disguise myself as a widow. He knows I disguise myself as a poor woman selling pen wipers. He knows I disguise myself as a nun. He knows I gave food and blankets to the poor. He knows I carry a dagger in my corset. He knows I have located 2 missing persons. He knows I have put the police onto 2 villains. He knows I have twice invaded his Baker Street rooms. He knows I used the name Ivy. One must assume that he now knows from Dr. Watson that a young woman named Ivy Meshel worked for the world's first and only scientific purgatorian. I sighed at this last, for I quite admired Dr. Watson, although I had encountered the good physician only 3 times. The first, when he had come to consult the purgatorian, a professional seeker of missing persons for the sake of his friend Sherlock Holmes. The second, when I had gone to ask him a question and he had given me a bromide for a headache. The third, when I had thrust an injured lady upon his care. Dr. Watson was the epitome of a gallant, sturdy English gentleman, willing to help anyone. I liked him tremendously, almost as much as I liked my brother, for despite everything I did adore Sherlock, though I knew him mainly through the very popular stories his friend Watson wrote about him, which I read as avidly as anyone in England. Why? Why did those of whom I cared always seem to prove my undoing? Sighing, I pressed my lips together and drew several heavy pencil lines, crossing out Ivy Meshel. What then? It was not just choosing a new name that baffled me. It was the all-encompassing problem of what to do and whom to be. Within what sort of woman should I next hide myself? A commoner? Mary or Susan? How tall? Yet the flower names I loved, such as rosemary, symbol of remembrance, or violet, symbol of hidden beauty and virtue, were out of the question, for Sherlock knew about the code Mother and I used. Nor could I fall back upon one of my middle names. I had, of course, the usual gentrified quota of them, being christened Enola Eudoria Hadassah Holmes. Enola E.H. Holmes. E.E.H.H. Just the way I felt. Hadassah had been my father's deceased sister name, which Sherlock would instantly recognize, and Eudoria even worse, being my mother's given name. Not that I cared in any way to style myself after my mother. Or did I? Curses, ye gods, I muttered naughtily, writing down Violet Vernet. Vernet being my mother's maiden name, which, again, Sherlock Holmes would recognize at once. But perhaps backwards. Tenrev. Well, no. But if I played the letters a little bit. Netver, never, every, ever. Ever what? Ever alone? Ever forlorn? Ever defiant, I told myself sternly. Ever to go on being what I am. A rebel. A dreamer, and a purgatorian, finder of the lost. It occurred to me that as a step in that direction, in order to hear news that did not reach print, I ought to try and find a position with some Fleet Street publication. Coincidentally, as I thought this, I heard my landlady's tortoise-like tread upon the stairs. "Newspapers, Mrs. Meshel?" she bellowed even before she had reached the landing. Being as deaf as the turnip, Mrs. Tupper seemed to find it necessary to make a great deal of noise. As I stood up, crossed my room, and threw everything that I had written into the fire, she knocked hard enough to crack walnuts. "Newspapers, Mrs. Meshel?" she shouted into my face just as I opened the door. "Thank you, Mrs. Tupper." She couldn't hear me, of course, but she could see my lips move in what I hoped was a smile as I took the papers from her hands. However, she did not then go away. Instead, she straightened a short, hunched form to its limit and fixed me with a watery gaze. "Mrs. Meshel," she declaimed, with the bravado of one who had just performed a moral duty. "It is no good to your shutting yourself up this way. Now, whatever happened, and it's none of my business, but whatever it was, it's no use getting pale about it. Now, it's a nice day out with a bit of sun and starting to feel springish. Now, why don't you get your bonnet on and go out for a walk at least?" Or I believed she had said something of the sort. I barely heard her, and I am sorry to say I shut the door in her face, but my gaze had caught upon the Daily Telegraph's headline, and fixed there. It said, "Sherlock Holmes, associate, mysteriously disappears. Dr. Watson's whereabouts unknown." Chapter 2. Not pausing even to take a seat, but standing where I was, with the skirt of my cheap cotton-at-home dress nearly in the fire, I read, "Events sure to send a frisson of horror through any spine with delicacy of feeling, having unfolded in Bloomsbury, with implications taking in the whole of London, if a missing British gentleman is not soon found. Dr. John Watson, a respected physician, perhaps best known as companion of and chronicler of the adventures of the famous detective, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, has most mystifyingly disappeared without a trace. Foremost among the thoughts of the absent man's family and friends, of course, is terror lest he might have fallen into the hands of some criminal enemy of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, to be used as a pawn in some nefarious scheme, bandied as a hostage or dispatched for the sake of revenge. Alternatively, concern has been expressed that carrying his black bag and identifying him as a physician, he might have been attacked by an anti-vaccination mob in the East End. No form of foul play at this time has been ruled out. Attempts have been made to trace Dr. Watson's movements this Wednesday last, on which day he departed to perform customary calls and errands, but failed to return to his home and business in the evening. Cab drivers are being questioned, and so forth. A great many words to describe, essentially, nothing. An absence, not newsworthy at all if it were not that my brother's name could be deployed in the headline. Dr. Watson had kissed his wife goodbye on Wednesday morning. This was Friday afternoon. The good doctor had been gone for 2 days. I imagine the police were saying with some justification that any number of harmless events might have caused the doctor's absence, and at any moment a telegram or letter should arrive explaining where and why he had been detained. Attempts are being made meant that the police were not yet investigating. Otherwise, the newspaper would have named the inspector in charge. No, at this point, the only people really trying to locate Dr. Watson were two: his wife and his friend, my brother, Sherlock Holmes. And now one more. Me. But wait. What if Watson's absence had been arranged by my brother as a scheme to trap me? Sherlock knew that I had embroidered myself in 2 cases of missing persons, and while he might not have understood that I invented Dr. Leslie Ragaston's scientific purgatorian, quite possibly he knew I had worked for the man. Did he appreciate that this was my life's calling, to be a finder of the lost? Did he guess how very fond I was of the fatherly Dr. Watson? Should I not, then, regard recent developments with the utmost suspicion? But even as these eminently sensible considerations traversed my mind, already I was throwing the newspaper into the fire, then rummaging in my wardrobe, considering possible ways to disguise myself, possible strategies to find out the details of Dr. Watson's disappearance, how best to approach the matter. Indeed, a straitjacket would not have stopped me, although I knew I would have to be very careful, which presented some difficulty, having spent the better part of the past month closeted in my lodging, bitter over my mother's failure to help me in my time of need. Having been, in other words, idle and sulking, I found myself woefully unprepared for action. There were a dozen items I required but did not have. Wrapping a nondescript shawl around my head and shoulders, I sallied forth to acquire them. Mrs. Tupper would be pleased. I was going for a walk. I did walk, all the way, because my emotions felt as tangled as the labyrinth passages of the slums, my thoughts as crowded and confused as the smutty tenements, with their peaked garrets looming over me, and a long walk would perhaps help me compose my mind into some form of order. My surroundings, however, did not promote serenity. A pieman cried, "Oat meat, tarts, 2 for a penny," while street urchins capered around him mocking, "Puppies and kittens, cats and rats," meaning the probable meats in his pies, and a constable came frowning along to rout the lot of them for blocking traffic. While the day was indeed springish, as Mrs. Tupper had said, the warming weather had increased the stench of the tenement privies, each of which served perhaps 200 of London's great unwashed, and of the nearby Thames, and of the gas-works looming over the slums like a bloated, shining caterpillar on steel legs, blighting everything beneath it. Very well, I was perhaps failing to appreciate the beauty of that sunny day. A rarity in London, where clouds of smoke generally held sway no matter what the weather elsewhere. But truly a hint of spring seemed only to increase the din and danger in the streets. I saw a district nurse, in her old-fashioned black bonnet, long-coated white apron, trying to make her way into a narrow court crisscrossed with clothes lines of washing, while lounging men and street brats and even some women shouted curses, throwing mud and stones and horses, droppings at her. Brave woman, I thought. But I admit that my next consideration as I walked on was whether a nurse garb might serve as a good disguise. Or perhaps the military-style black skirt and red jersey of one of General Booth's Hallelujah lasses. It seemed to me that people encountering someone in uniform observing the clothes, not the individual. But Sherlock Holmes was no ordinary observer. Aware that I had masqueraded as a nun, he would be on the lookout for something else of the sort. A deaconess, a nanny, a nurse. No, I had to invent some disguise that he could not possibly expect of me. By now, blessedly, I had left the East End behind me. Instead of threading my way between tenements, I now walked pavements along wider cobbled streets, and ahead of me loomed the dome of St. Paul's, a Grecian columned landmark that contrasted strangely, I thought, with the shiny steel gasworks just as tall, not to speak of the gargoyled Gothic steeples of other churches nearby, or the square-towered, corniced Italianate resident I was just then passing. Most of London was such a hodgepodge, railroads and factories, but also edifices, French, Second Empire and Moorish, Georgian and Regency, plus Tudor revival, a classical revival this and revival that, a city uncertain like me of what appearance to present. Here, even more so in the East End, one saw all sorts of people. Well-dressed ladies shopped their haberdashers and milliners and perfumeries, moving briskly about their business so that they would not be mistaken for much adorned ladies of a different sort loitering on the paths. Shopgirls mounted with the agility of goats to the top of omnibuses, while visitors from the country gawked at everything. Delivery boys on bicycles, bandbox vendors with their wares and poles across their shoulders, chimney sweeps trudging along as black as their brushes, ink-stained students carrying books, street musicians, gentlemen dressed in sober grey or black from head to toe, and gents, quite a different breed, swell, dresses in search of amusement. My brothers had once hypothesized that I was masquerading as one of those. Here came a short-haired woman in billycock hat with coachman cape, a stick in one gloveless hand and a leash of a bull terrier in the other. I am certain my brothers were afraid I was going to turn out even worse. perhaps puffing a cigar. By now I was walking to the city itself, that is to say, the oldest part of London. One would think London Centre, but it was not so. Not any more than the Tower was London Centre, or Covent Garden, Piccadilly Circus, or Trafalgar Square, or Buckingham Palace, or Westminster, where the Houses of Parliament were. London had no more centre than one of Mrs. Tupper's sheep's head stews did. Resisting any further comparison between the city's confusion and my own current state of mind, I made my way through Holywell Street. A narrow, winding, dirty thoroughfare that could not have been more ironically misnamed or misused. Its picturesque, high-gabbled old buildings were given over mostly to vendors of low publications and cheap photographic prints. However, I was not here to look at liligoths of young ladies exposing their petticoats and legs whilst lacing their Balmoral boots. I sought a vendor of a different sort. As far back as the time of Queen Elizabeth, Holywell Street had housed mercers, and echoes of that silk and fancy textile trade lingered on in the form of dealers in costume, finery, queer old clothing, and the like, for masquerades. Wooden signs carved in the shape of masks grinned or grimaced down upon me, most unpleasantly as I shouldered in and elbowed my way through the crowded lane. Not only was Holywell Street itself quite ancient, crooked, and narrow, but the print vendors' tawdry wires overflowed their shops onto the pavements, reaching out for one. Indeed, as I struggled along, a winsome little girl, no more than 6 years old, plucked at my sleeve, offering to sell me what appeared at first glance to be a pack of playing cards. My second glance made me shudder and hasten onwards. There, at last I saw, suspended from the overhanging eaves of a venerable lath and plaster building, a wooden sign which had likely been there as long as the structure itself. Carved in the shape of a rooster, it had to mark the shop for which I was searching.